Right, get ready because today we're going deep on this painting. It's called Violenze EZ2 Recogniz
Okay.
by Houston artist Bob Camblin. And
Hmm.
this one is really something, I
Yeah.
mean, talk about symbolism overload, right?
Right.
So you've got this double-headed artist, and he's got a safari hat on
Uh-huh.
and like a monocle, but it's dangling from a fishhook.
Oh, wow.
And then he's holding this tube of old paint and a brush that's shaped like a figure-4 trap. And to top it all off, he's standing next to a pyramid that's just covered in scribbles.
What?
It's wild, right?
Yeah, it's like Salvador Dali went to a wrestling match with a Zen master, you know?
Totally, yeah. It's so out there. And we've got a few sources that we're going to use to try to unpack this visual feast.
Okay.
So we've got some excerpts from Camblin's own book, Everyday Enlightenment.
Okay.
And then there's this YouTube video analysis from the Incomplete Works channel.
Right.
And then also a more formal art analysis. It's just called Violenze EZ2 Recognizes an Analysis.
Okay, so breaking it down from a few different angles.
Exactly, yeah. And the big question, I think, for me is like, what is the violence that's so easy to recognize
Right.
in the artwork? Is it just like the imagery, the weirdness of it all?
Yeah.
Or is Camblin saying something more, something deeper, about how we see the world or even ourselves?
That's the mystery, isn't it?
Mm.
And I think to start, we have to look at that double-headed artist.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful image. I mean, it just grabs you right away, and it kind of sets the whole mood for the painting.
It's like he's looking in two directions at once.
Yeah.
Like inward and outward at the same time.
Yes, like trying to see both sides, you know?
Almost like he's trying to like make two different perspectives agree, or see how they fit together.
That's a good point. In the YouTube video, actually, they connect this to, Zen Buddhism and that concept of the experiencer self and the observer self.
Oh, interesting.
That idea that part of you is just caught up in living life, just experiencing, and then there's another part that's like watching, analyzing, trying to make sense of it all.
Right. Like two different modes of being.
Exactly. And when you think about what Camblin says in his book, Everyday Enlightenment, he talks about how enlightenment comes from looking deeply at the world as it is, just seeing it for what it is.
Yeah, I remember that part.
So could it be that this double-headed artist, is that what he's showing us? That struggle to be both the observer and the experiencer at the same time.
I like that. Yeah, it's like he's stuck between those two ways of being.
Right, and maybe that tension, that's part of the violence that Camblin's talking about.
The violence of perception.
Exactly, like maybe it's not about some external conflict, but more about that internal struggle to reconcile those different parts of ourselves.
I can see that. Yeah, and then you've got these other weird elements too, like that tube of old paint.
Yeah, and that figure-4 brush, that's a strange one.
So weird.
The old paint makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, is it about past experiences or maybe the pressure of what he's already accomplished?
Maybe even just like getting older,
Yeah, like his own mortality.
I was so drawn to that figure-4 brush, though.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a weird combination of things.
Oh,
It's like
yeah.
you've got this thing that's used for hunting, for trapping, for violence.
Right.
And then he's using it to create art.
That's where we start to see that theme of turning violence into something else, something expressive,
Oh, interesting.
The formal analysis, actually, they talk about that as like a major theme in his work, like repurposing violence, finding a new use for it.
That makes sense. Yeah. And, in his book, Camblin talks about finding beauty in absurdity and humor in decay.
Right, right.
So is he saying that even violence can be transformed? That even in the darkest places, there's still potential for beauty and meaning?
It's a powerful idea, for sure. And then there's that pyramid.
Yeah, and that strange writing on
It's
it.
like a riddle.
Totally ambiguous. Like, what is he even trying to say there?
Well, the YouTube video, they talk about the colors on the pyramid, the red, blue, yellow.
The primary color.
Right, and they see those as representing life, death, and the human condition.
Wow.
And then you add the text on top of that, which is just this jumble of words and symbols.
It's like a code you can't crack.
Yeah, it creates this feeling of unease, like you're on the verge of understanding, but you just can't quite get there.
Almost like the violence is in the trying,
What do you mean?
Like the violence is in trying to make sense of something that maybe doesn't make sense.
Oh, I see. Yeah, like our brains are trying to force it into a category, even if it doesn't belong there.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the title, right? Violenze EZ2 Recogniz.
Right.
Do you think he's being ironic?
Oh, how so?
Like, is he saying that violence is actually way harder to recognize than we think it is?
That's an interesting take.
It feels like he's pushing us to look beyond the surface,
Oh, yeah.
to really question what we think we know about violence. Because maybe it's not always so obvious. Maybe it's not always a physical act.
Right, like what about the violence of our perceptions, the way we judge and categorize the world around us?
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe that's part of the violence too.
Yeah.
The way we limit ourselves and others with our thinking.
And that connects with what the YouTube video calls violence as a construct of perception.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So they're saying that violence isn't just physical, it can be emotional, intellectual, even like existential.
Okay, starting to see what they mean.
Like holding on to rigid beliefs, refusing to see other perspectives, that can be a form of violence too.
Right, because it closes us off. It prevents us from connecting, from growing.
And if we think about what Camblin says in his book about looking beyond the surface,
Yeah.
could it be that he's asking us to see how our own perceptions, our own ways of seeing might be a form of violence?
That's a big question.
It is. It really makes you think.
It's seeing that we're all just victims of our limited understanding.
Or is he offering a way out, a path towards a more enlightened way of seeing? That's what we have to figure out.
I like that. And there's this one part in the YouTube video that really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
They say, to create is to destroy. To trap is to expose.
That's a good one.
What do you make of that? Especially with the figure 4 trap being used as a brush.
I think that's a really key question, yeah, because it gets to the heart of what makes this painting so interesting.
Okay.
It seems like he's saying that even in creating something, there's a kind of destruction happening.
Like you have to break things down to build something new.
Exactly. You have to challenge the old ways, even destroy parts of yourself to make room for something different.
It's like that figure 4 trap, which is all about capturing and controlling.
Right.
It becomes a symbol of that tension between creation and destruction. You know, it makes me think about how Camblin emphasizes self-inquiry in his book.
Yeah.
He even calls the book itself a mirror, you know, reflecting the reader's own mind.
Right. Like it's a tool for self-discovery.
So is it possible that this painting, Violenze EZ2 Recogniz, is also a kind of self-portrait?
I think so, yeah. Like he's showing us his own internal struggles.
The violence of his own creative process, maybe?
And inviting us to look at our own, too.
So is the point to make us feel uncomfortable? Like, is that part of the violence he wants us to recognize?
That's a good point, because sometimes when our perceptions are challenged, our beliefs are questioned, it can feel like a kind of violence.
Right, it's unsettling, it makes you question things.
But maybe that discomfort, that's where growth happens.
You know, maybe it's the spark that leads to greater awareness.
To a deeper understanding of the world and ourselves.
But it's like Camblin is trying to wake us up with this painting.
Yeah.
To shake us out of our complacency and make us see the violence that's all around us, even in the way we think and perceive.
He's not giving us easy answers, that's for sure.
No, but he's making us ask the hard questions.
And maybe that's the first step.
Yeah, to recognize that violence exists in all its forms and to start asking ourselves what we're going to do about it.
Exactly. It's a challenge, an invitation to see the world differently and to choose a different path.
And maybe a more compassionate one?
I hope so.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, look, I'm struggling with this too, and I'm putting it all out there for you to see.
Right.
And it's like, it makes you want to struggle along with him, you know,
Exactly what you mean.
to really confront those parts of yourself that maybe, you know, are contributing to the problem.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the formal analysis, they talk about how Camblin uses these collage techniques in the painting.
Okay.
You know, montage, like all these different elements, the fish hook, the brush, the pyramid, it's all kind of like smashed together.
Yeah, it's not like a realistic scene or anything.
Oh, not at all.
It's more like dreamlike, you know, or maybe nightmarish,
That's a good way to put it.
depending on how you're feeling that day.
Right, and I think that fragmentation, that kind of disorientation you feel when you look at it,
Yeah.
that's part of what makes it so effective, you know?
In terms of the violence,
Yeah, like he's mirroring the way our brains try to make sense of the world.
how so?
Well, like we're always taking these bits and pieces of information,
Yeah.
and we're trying to put them together to make a story out of them.
To make it make sense.
Exactly, and we don't even realize we're doing it half the time.
And sometimes those stories we create, they end up being harmful.
Right. They lead to violence.
Not because the information itself was bad, but because of the way we interpreted it.
Yeah, it's all about perception, you know?
Camblin's really hitting us over the head with that, huh?
He is, and I think he's saying that the violence isn't necessarily out there in the world.
But in here.
Yeah, in our minds, in the way we choose to see things.
So what happens when those perceptions are challenged? Like when we encounter something that doesn't fit into our neat little boxes.
Ooh, that's a good question. That's when things get really interesting.
Why?
Because that's when we have a choice, you know?
Hook.
Do we cling to our old ways of seeing, even if they're causing harm?
Or do we open ourselves up to something new?
Yeah, even if it means letting go of some of our most cherished beliefs.
And that letting go, that can be really hard.
Can feel like a kind of violence in itself.
It's like ripping off a Band-Aid, right?
Exactly. It's painful, but it's necessary for healing.
So we've got violence as a catalyst for change, violence as part of perception, violence in creation.
Yeah, it's a lot.
My head's spinning.
But I think the important thing is that Camblin isn't talking about violence in the traditional sense, you know?
Not like physical violence.
Right. It's more like a metaphor.
For what?
For any force that shakes things up, you know? That disrupts the status quo.
Like a disruption.
Yeah, that challenges us to confront the truth about ourselves and the world.
Even if it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about those moments of friction, of conflict, where things break apart.
So they could be put back together in a new way.
Right. Hopefully a better way.
And that's where that figure 4 brush comes back in, right?
Oh, yeah, good point.
It's like he's taking something associated with violence, with control,
Yeah.
and turning it into something creative, something that builds.
It's not about glorifying violence. It's about recognizing that it has this potential for transformation.
To be something else.
Exactly. He's saying that even in the darkest places, there's still hope. There's still beauty to be found.
That's a nice thought. I like that. But it also makes me wonder,
What's that?
what are we supposed to do with this?
Yeah.
You know, how do we take this awareness of violence and turn it into something positive?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think Camblin's giving us any easy answers.
Wow.
It's up to us to figure it out, to find our own way forward.
He's really putting the responsibility on us.
He is, but I think that's kind of empowering too, you know?
Okay.
He's not telling us what to think.
He's just showing us the truth and say, what are you going to do about it?
And maybe that's the first step.
What do you mean?
Just acknowledging that these different forms of violence exist. The subtle ones, the obvious ones, the ones inside us and the ones out there in the world.
To see them for what they are.
Right, because once we see them, then we can start making different choices.
More conscious choices.
Yeah, about how we interact with the world, how we treat each other.
Like being more aware of our biases.
Exactly, and being willing to have those tough conversations.
To challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah.
To listen to people who see things differently.
And maybe, just maybe, that willingness to embrace the discomfort, to face the hard truth.
That's where real change begins.
I think you're right, because when our perceptions are challenged, when our beliefs are questioned,
That's when we have the opportunity to grow.
to evolve as individuals and as a society.
This painting, it's like a wake-up call.
It is.
With all its weirdness and symbolism, it's like Camblin is saying, hey, the world is messed up.
Yeah.
And violence is everywhere, even in the way we think.
But it's also a reminder that we have a choice.
To change things.
Yeah. We can either keep perpetuating the violence, or we can choose to transform it.
And that choice, it's ours to make.
It's a huge responsibility, but it's also an amazing opportunity.
Because if we can learn to see the world through Camblin's eyes,
Yeah.
to recognize the violence and the beauty, the darkness and the light,
Then maybe we can start to create a world where violence isn't the norm.
where compassion and understanding and creativity can thrive.
That's a beautiful vision.
It is. And as we go into the last part of this deep dive, I want you to think about this.
Okay.
What forms of violence are you overlooking in your own life?
It's a tough question, but it's worth asking.
And how can you use that awareness to create something positive, to make a difference? He's really pushing us to be more mindful, isn't he?
He is, like he's saying, look around, pay attention. There's violence everywhere, but there's also so much beauty and potential.
And don't be afraid to really see it all.
Yeah.
Even the stuff that makes you squirm a little.
Right, the stuff that makes you uncomfortable.
And I think it's so smart to use art as that wake-up call.
Oh, totally, yeah, because it's not like someone lecturing you. It's more like an invitation to explore, to question, to really feel something.
And remember in his book, he talks about how the book itself is like a mirror,
Oh, yeah.
reflecting the reader's mind.
Right.
I think this painting is kind of like that too.
You do.
Yeah, it's not just reflecting Camblin's struggles, but ours too.
I can see that.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope people take away from all this?
That's a good question. I think for me it's that violence can be so much more than just, hitting someone or something like that.
Right.
It's about our limited ways of seeing,
Our perceptions.
Yeah, and how we struggle to understand ourselves and the world around us.
And how sometimes recognizing that violence, that struggle,
Yeah.
that's the first step to really changing things.
Totally. Recognizing it is huge.
This deep dive started with one painting, but it's really opened up a whole can of worms, hasn't it?
It really has so many questions.
Yeah, like what forms of violence are we ignoring in our own lives?
And how can we, use art or even just paying attention to help us see more clearly?
Even if what we see is kind of disturbing,
Yeah, even if it's not what we want to see.
it's about being willing to question those easy answers
Right. Those knee-jerk reactions we all have.
and to sit with that uncomfortable feeling of not knowing.
Of not having all the answers.
And maybe that's where the real growth happens.
I think you're right. Maybe enlightenment isn't about finding the solution to violence.
But about understanding it.
Yeah, seeing all its sides, its complexity, how it shows up everywhere, even in the little things.
And maybe when we embrace that complexity, when we see the violence in ourselves and the world around us,
Then we can start finding better ways to deal with it.
more creative ways, more compassionate ways.
Exactly. It's not about giving up. It's about finding a new approach.
This deep dive may have started with one painting, but it's really given us a lot to think about.
It has a whole new way of seeing things.
So to everyone listening, keep those questions alive,
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep looking for both the beauty and the violence in everything you encounter.
Because that's where the real growth is,
Yeah.
the real potential for change.
I like that. Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep looking deeply.